The morning my stepmother handed me a cardboard box with my things inside it, she was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one. She stood in the doorway of what used to be my father's office, the office where I had worked beside him for 11 years, and she smiled like she had already won. She told me the company now belonged to her. She told me my father had signed everything over before he died. She told me I had 1 hour to leave the building before she called security. And the thing that hurt the most in that moment was not the box. It was not the smile. It was the fact that I had spent 11 years doing everything right, and I still walked out of that building carrying my mug, my notebooks, and a photo of my father in a box meant for someone who had been fired. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. If you had given 11 years of your life to build something with your father, something that was supposed to carry his name and his legacy into the future, and then someone you never trusted took it all with a piece of paper, what would you do? Would you fight loud? Would you walk away? Would you go quiet and plan? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Ackles' place, because what she chose to do next is not what most people expect. My name is Ackles, and I want to tell you about the morning I lost everything my father built, and the day I got it back without raising my voice once. But before I get to that morning, I have to take you back to where this really started, because no one loses something like this in a single moment. It always starts earlier, quieter, and in ways you keep telling yourself do not mean anything. My father, Gerald, built Caldwell Precision Manufacturing from nothing, not from family money, not from a loan someone handed him out of generosity. He built it from a second-hand lathe machine in a rented garage in the industrial end of our city, from 12-hour days and cheap coffee and a belief that if he made things with enough care, people would notice. They did notice. By the time I was in high school, Caldwell Precision had 40 employees and contracts with 3 regional engineering firms. By the time I graduated college and came to work beside him, the company had grown to nearly 200 employees, a proper manufacturing floor, and a reputation that took almost 2 decades to build. My father was not a soft man, but he was a fair one. He believed that work spoke louder than titles. He had no patience for people who coasted on someone else's effort, and he had even less patience for people who took credit for things they had not earned. He used to say that a name on a door means nothing if the work behind the door is hollow. I grew up hearing that. I grew up believing it. And when I came to work at Caldwell Precision at 23 years old, I did not come in as the owner's daughter looking for a comfortable chair. I came in and asked my father to put me on the production floor first. I wanted to understand the machine before I ever touched the paperwork. He made me work every department for the first 3 years. Quality control, inventory, client liaison, operations, scheduling. I made mistakes. I fixed them. I stayed late without being asked. I built relationships with every team leader on the floor, and I learned how to read a production report the way my father read it, not as a summary, but as a story about where things were working and where something quiet was starting to go wrong. My father and I were not just family at that company, we were a team. Then Margaret came into our lives. My father met Margaret at a business association dinner when I was 26 years old. I was not suspicious at first. My father had been alone for a long time after my mother passed, and I genuinely wanted him to have someone in his life. Margaret was well-dressed, well-spoken, and smart in the social kind of way. She asked the right questions and laughed at the right moments and made my father feel seen in a way he had not felt in years. I understood that. I respected it. I told myself that what mattered was his happiness. They dated for 8 months. Then my father told me he was going to ask Margaret to marry him. He sat across from me at the small table in his office, the same table where we ate lunch together twice a week, and he told me he hoped I would support the decision. I told him I did, and I meant it mostly. There was something about Margaret that made me careful, something I could not name cleanly at the time. She was warm in public and watchful in private. She complimented me in a way that always had a tiny edge to it, like the compliment was wrapped around something smaller and sharper. But I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself she was nervous about my approval. I told myself people are complicated and that a few uncomfortable feelings were not evidence of anything. I was wrong about that, But I did not know how wrong for another 4 years. Margaret and my father married quietly, just family and close friends, at a small venue near the water. I was there. I smiled for the photos. I danced with my father at the reception and told him I was happy for him, and I was in the parts of me that wanted him to be okay. But watching Margaret at that reception, I noticed something. She was already asking questions about the company, not in a curious getting-to-know-you way, in a specific way. She asked one of our senior operations managers about reporting structures. She asked our finance director's wife about whether the company had any outside investors. She asked my father's oldest friend, who had been with Caldwell Precision since the early days, how the ownership was structured. I noticed all of it. I filed it away. I did not say anything because I did not yet have anything solid to say. In the first year of the marriage, Margaret began showing up at the company, not in any official role, just visiting, she said, bringing my father lunch, sitting in his office during the afternoon, occasionally walking the production floor with him like a curious tourist. The employees were polite to her because she was the owner's wife and because my father seemed genuinely happy to have her near. I was polite to her because I loved my father and I was not going to make his new marriage a battlefield. But the visits became more frequent, and somewhere in the second year the visits became something different. Margaret started attending client meetings, not all of them but some. She would sit in the corner and listen. Occasionally she would say something, and what she said was usually not wrong exactly, but it was the kind of input that positioned her as someone important without her having done any of the foundational work. I watched my father beam at her in those meetings like she was discovering a talent he had always known she had. I watched the clients glance at her with mild confusion about who exactly she was. I stayed professional. I stayed focused. I told myself it was fine. In year 3 of the marriage, my father's health began to change. He was 61 years old when the diagnosis came. Parkinson's disease, not aggressive at first but real. The tremors were mild initially, more of an inconvenience than a limitation. But my father was a proud man, and even a mild tremor to a man who had spent his life building precision equipment was a wound to his identity. He did not want to talk about it at the company. He managed his schedule more carefully. He leaned on me more, which I was glad to do. I took on more of the operational decisions. I handled more of the client relationships directly. I restructured the weekly reporting system so that my father could stay informed without needing to be physically present for every meeting. Margaret watched all of this very closely. In year 4, something shifted in the way she spoke to me. It became more direct, more territorial. She would occasionally refer to decisions I had made as decisions she and my father had discussed, even when I knew they had not been discussed with her at all. She began inserting herself into conversations with our finance team about cash flow and contracts. She started referring to the company as our company in ways that felt less like a proud wife's language and more like a slow, deliberate positioning. When I mentioned to my father that I felt like some boundaries around company governance were getting blurry, he looked tired and told me he was sure we could all find a way to work together. I backed off. I should not have backed off. But he looked so tired and I loved him and I did not want to create more stress for him during an already hard time. My father's condition progressed faster in year 5. By then his fine motor control had deteriorated significantly. He had good days and difficult ones. He still came to the office when he felt well enough, and on those days you could feel the whole building lift a little, the way a room lifts when the person who belongs in it most finally walks back in. But the difficult days were becoming more frequent. He had appointed me as acting director of operations 18 months earlier, a formal internal title that gave me the authority I needed to keep the company running day to day. He had also begun conversations with our company attorney, a quiet man named David Harrow who had been with Caldwell Precision for almost 15 years, about his estate planning and the future of the company. I was not present for all of those conversations and I did not ask to be. My father had always handled his personal affairs with privacy and I respected that. David had told me privately, in the way a careful attorney signals something without stating it directly, that my father's wishes regarding the company were clear and had been clearly documented. I took that to mean what any reasonable person would take it to mean, that the company would pass to me, that everything my father and I had built together over more than a decade would be protected in the way he had always indicated it would be. I trusted that. I focused on running the company well. I focused on being present for my father in whatever ways he needed. I drove him to appointments when he would let me. I sat with him in his living room on Sunday evenings when he was feeling well, and we would go over the week together the way we always had, the production updates, the client news, the small proud moments when something on the floor ran perfectly or a long-term contract was renewed. Margaret was usually elsewhere on those Sunday evenings, which I noticed but which I did not examine too hard. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 weeks after his condition moved into a late stage that the doctors had been anticipating. He was at home. Margaret was there. I arrived 40 minutes later, called by Margaret, and I sat with him for a long time before anyone else came. The funeral was a week later. More than 200 people came. Colleagues, clients, old friends, employees from every era of the company. A man who had been one of his earliest machinists, now retired, flew in from another state just to be there. My father would have been embarrassed by all of it and secretly deeply moved. I held myself together through the service. I gave the eulogy. I thanked the people who had loved him and the people who had worked beside him, and I meant every word I said about who he was and what he had built and what he deserved to be remembered for. I went home that night and did not sleep much. 3 weeks after the funeral, Margaret called a meeting. She did not call it that. She called it a family conversation about moving forward. She asked me to come to the house, my father's house, the house I had grown up in, the house that was now hers, on a Saturday morning. I went. I wore professional clothes without thinking much about why, only realizing later that some part of me had already sensed that this was not going to be a personal conversation. Margaret was seated at the dining room table when I arrived. Her sister was there too, a woman named Renata who had always made me mildly uncomfortable in a way I could not pin down. There was a folder on the table. Margaret had her hands folded on top of it. She told me she wanted to discuss the company. She told me she had been reviewing things with her own legal advisors. She told me there was a document, a will amendment, she called it, that had been signed by my father 6 weeks before his death, which superseded the previous estate documents on file with David Harrow. She told me this amendment had been prepared by a different attorney, one she referred to as a specialist in estate matters, and that it transferred full ownership of Caldwell Precision Manufacturing to her. I sat very still. I asked her to show me the document. She slid the folder across the table. I opened it, I read it. The language was clean and formal, the way legal documents are. It bore what appeared to be my father's signature. It was dated 6 weeks before his death. It was notarized. It listed a law firm I did not recognize and an attorney whose name I had never heard my father mention. And it said, in clear language, that Margaret Eleanor Caldwell was to receive full ownership of Caldwell Precision Manufacturing, all associated assets, and all governing authority over its operations upon the death of Gerald Caldwell. My hands were steady. I do not know how they were steady. Something in me went very quiet and very cold in the same moment. I asked Margaret one question. I asked her whether David Harrow knew about this document. She said David Harrow's documents were outdated. I thanked her for showing me. I took a photo of the document with my phone before she could tell me not to. She started to object and then stopped herself. I put the folder back on the table. I stood up, said I needed time to review everything with my own advisor, and left the house. I sat in my car outside for 4 minutes. I remember counting. I needed 4 minutes before I could drive safely. Then I called David Harrow. David asked me to come to his office that same afternoon. I did. I showed him the photo of the document. He read it very carefully, twice. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 15 years of knowing him. He looked like a man who had just confirmed something he had hoped was not true. He told me this document conflicted directly with the clear and fully executed estate plan my father had put in place 14 months earlier. He told me the will amendment Margaret had presented bore a signature date that fell during a period when my father's neurological condition had significantly impaired his fine motor function. He told me the attorney named on the document had called his office once, briefly, approximately 3 months before my father died, asking general questions about the Caldwell estate, a call David had found odd at the time but had not been able to act on since my father himself had not authorized David to share any information. He told me one more thing, quietly and carefully. He said that in his professional opinion, based on his long familiarity with my father's signature and the medical timeline, the signature on that document deserved serious scrutiny. He said the word scrutiny. He did not say forgery, but we both understood what we were talking about. I asked him what I needed to do. He told me to do nothing visible for the next 72 hours while he made some calls. He told me to keep showing up at work as normal. He told me not to tip Margaret off that I had spoken to him. He told me to document everything I could about my current operational role, my access credentials, my communications with clients, and my decision-making history at the company. I drove home. I did not sleep that night either. The next morning I came to the office as normal. I greeted people as normal. I handled the Tuesday operations review as normal. I answered emails as normal. Inside, I was running 2 separate processes at once. The professional one that kept the building functioning and the private one that was methodically going through every filing cabinet, every saved email thread, every contract I had signed or co-signed, every client communication that bore my name and my operational authority over the past 11 years. I was not panicking, I was building. Margaret did not come to the office that Tuesday or Wednesday. She came on Thursday morning and she brought someone with her. She brought a man she introduced to the senior staff as her transition advisor. He was polished and calm, and he smiled at people in the practiced way that people who are about to take something from you sometimes smile. Margaret called a brief all-staff meeting in the main conference room and told the employees that in light of her late husband's wishes, she would be assuming leadership of Caldwell Precision effective immediately. She said she was deeply committed to honoring Gerald's legacy. She said she was grateful for everyone's patience during this difficult time. I sat in that meeting in the third row. I kept my face neutral. Several of my colleagues glanced at me. Thomas, the operations floor lead who had worked with my father for 18 years, looked at me with an expression that said everything without saying anything. After the meeting, Margaret found me in the hallway and asked if she could speak with me privately. We went to the small conference room. She closed the door. She told me she wanted to give me the opportunity to transition gracefully. She said she understood this was hard. She said she hoped we could handle things professionally and without unnecessary drama. She said she would be generous with my severance package given how long I had been with the company. She said severance, like I was an employee who was being let go, like 11 years of building that company beside my father was a contractor arrangement that could be ended with a check. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I was reviewing things with my advisor and would be in touch. I kept my voice steady and my face calm, and I left that room before she could say anything else. I called David from the parking garage. He told me the situation was progressing and that I needed to formally respond to the will amendment through the estate probate process. He had already begun preparing the challenge. He had also quietly put me in contact with a forensic document examiner who specialized in signature authentication. The document examiner's name was Carol Brent. She was a retired federal examiner with 30 years of experience and a client list she was not allowed to discuss. I met with her on Friday. I showed her everything David had shared about my father's authenticated signatures across his lifetime, contracts, correspondence, legal filings going back decades. She compared them systematically against the signature on the will amendment. She did not give me her conclusion on the spot. She said she needed 10 days to complete her analysis properly. 10 days felt like a very long time. In those 10 days, Margaret moved fast. She changed the access codes to the executive office suite. She had the transition advisor begin reviewing client accounts. She scheduled meetings with our 3 largest contract clients and introduced herself as the new operational head. She had the company email system updated to list her name under the ownership field. She asked our IT coordinator to run a report on all current employee access levels, which the IT coordinator, a careful, observant young man named Priya who had worked with me for 4 years, quietly told me about the same afternoon it happened. I said thank you and kept building my file. On the 8th day, Margaret's transition advisor came to my office, which I still occupied because no one had formally asked me to leave yet, and told me that Margaret had decided my position was redundant in the new structure. He handed me a typed letter. He told me I had until Friday to finalize my departure. He said Margaret wanted things handled respectfully. I read the letter. I thanked him for delivering it. I placed it on my desk and went back to what I had been working on. On the 9th day, David called me with 2 things. First, he told me the estate challenge had been formally filed and that the probate court had been notified of the competing documents. Second, he told me that the law firm listed on Margaret's will amendment, the specialist in estate matters, had been contacted by his office for verification, and that the firm had confirmed they had prepared the document but had some irregularities in their file regarding the execution meeting. Specifically, the documentation of witnesses present at the signing was incomplete, and the notary listed had a record that warranted additional review. On the 10th day, Carol Brent called me. She said her analysis was complete. She said the signature on the will amendment showed multiple characteristics inconsistent with my father's authenticated signature samples. She said the pen pressure pattern, the baseline alignment, and several specific letter formations were inconsistent with samples from across his lifetime, including samples from just 3 months prior to the amendment's date. She said her professional conclusion, stated to a reasonable degree of forensic certainty, was that the signature on the will amendment was not produced by Gerald Caldwell. I wrote down every word she said. My hand was very steady. I asked her if she would be willing to provide a formal report and, if necessary, testimony. She said that was why people hired her. I forwarded everything to David within the hour. Friday arrived, the day I was supposed to finalize my departure. I came to the office in the morning as usual. I had a quiet conversation with Thomas, the floor lead, and with Priya from IT, and with 3 other senior team members who had been with the company long enough to remember every decision I had ever made inside those walls. I did not tell them everything. I told them enough. Thomas looked at me for a long moment and said, "We're not going anywhere." Priya said the same thing in fewer words. The others nodded. At 11 in the morning, Margaret arrived with her transition advisor, and this time a man in a security uniform she had clearly arranged through an outside firm. She came to my office. She told me it was Friday and it was time for me to collect my things. She had a cardboard box in her hands. She placed it on my desk. I looked at the box. I looked at her. I had thought a great deal about what this moment would feel like, and what I had imagined was something large: rage, grief, humiliation. What I actually felt was very clear and very quiet, like the moment before you finally say the true thing you have been holding for a long time. I told Margaret that I was not going to be leaving. I told her that the will amendment she had presented to me was currently the subject of a formal forensic examination and a probate court challenge. I told her that a certified forensic document examiner had completed an analysis concluding the signature on that document was not my father's. I told her that the law firm that prepared the document was already under review for irregularities in the execution record. I told her that David Harrow, my father's attorney of 15 years, had the original and fully executed estate documents on file that clearly established my position with the company. And I told her that if she attempted to remove me from this building, I had the right to remain pending the resolution of the legal proceedings that were already underway. I did not raise my voice once. Margaret's face did several things in a short period of time. The first thing it did was go very still. The second thing it did was look at the transition advisor. The third thing it did, and this is the thing I remember most clearly, was try to smile. Like the smile was a tool she reached for automatically because it had worked before. She said I was making this very difficult. She said my father would not have wanted this. She said I was being emotional. I told her I was being precise. Then I took the cardboard box she had brought for my things and I set it outside the office door. The transition advisor asked Margaret in a low voice whether they should proceed. She did not answer him. The security guard stood in the hallway looking uncertain. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. Margaret stood there for a long moment, then she left. She called me 3 times that afternoon. I did not answer. She sent 2 emails. I forwarded them to David. What happened in the following 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way legal proceedings on television are dramatic. It was methodical, it was documented, it was thorough. David filed the formal challenge. Carol Brent submitted her forensic report. The probate court ordered an independent forensic review which confirmed Carol's findings. The notary listed on the document was interviewed and gave an account of the signing event that raised further questions about who had been present, and whether my father had understood what he was signing, or whether, in the advanced state of his neurological condition at that time, he had been in a position to meaningfully consent to any legal document at all. The attorney from the firm that had prepared the document was also interviewed. He was a young attorney who had been in practice for only 4 years. His account of the events was fragmented and inconsistent in ways that mattered. He retained his own counsel within days of being contacted. Margaret retained a litigation team. They were aggressive in the way litigation teams are paid to be aggressive. They filed counterarguments about the validity of the earlier estate documents. They questioned David Harrow's impartiality. They argued that my father had been of sound enough mind to make his own choices. They said a lot of things in a lot of formal language about the rights of a surviving spouse. But they could not explain Carol Brent's report. They could not explain the notary's account. They could not explain why a man who had been working with David Harrow for 15 years and who had completed comprehensive estate planning 14 months before his death would have secretly engaged a different attorney to fundamentally reverse those plans without telling David, without telling me, and without leaving any record of his intention to do so. They could not explain any of it because there was nothing legitimate to explain. The probate court ruled 6 weeks after the challenge was filed. The will amendment was invalidated. The original estate documents were confirmed as the controlling instruments. Caldwell Precision Manufacturing passed to me in full accordance with what my father had actually planned and documented and signed when his hands and his mind were still entirely his own. The morning I received the ruling, I sat in my car outside the building for a moment. Not 4 minutes this time, just one quiet minute. I thought about my father at his small table in the garage where it all started. I thought about his hands on the lathe, steady and sure. I thought about the lunches we ate together twice a week at the small table in his office. I thought about the last Sunday evening we sat together going over the week, how tired he was, how proud, how certain that what he had built was going to be okay. Then I got out of the car and went to work. The transition advisor was gone by that point. He had disengaged from the arrangement once the legal proceedings made the outcome clear. Several of Margaret's proposed structural changes had been quietly reversed by the operations team in the weeks prior, not because anyone had told them to, but because they knew the building and they knew what worked. Margaret did not come to the office after the ruling. She called me once, a week later. I answered because I wanted to hear what she would say. She said she was sorry. She said she had been badly advised. She said she hoped we could find a way to handle the house and the personal estate items with some dignity. She said the word dignity in the same voice she had used to say the word respectfully and the word gracefully, and I recognized by now that those words in her mouth were not really about dignity or respect or grace. They were about what she hoped to preserve for herself. I told her to communicate through her attorney going forward. She started to say something else. I said goodbye clearly and ended the call. The legal consequences for what had happened with the document were not something I had to engineer. Once a forensic analysis establishes that a signature is not genuine, and once a notary account becomes inconsistent, and once a young attorney is being represented by his own counsel, the processes that follow those findings are not in my hands. They belong to the court and to the bar and to the authorities whose job it is to follow those things where they lead. I gave my statement when I was asked. I provided my documentation. I told the truth clearly and completely. The rest was not my work to do. The company in the months that followed did not fall apart. It did not spiral. If anything, it steadied, because it had been running steadily all along through everything, because the people on that floor and in those offices and on those client accounts had been doing their jobs well and continued to do their jobs well. Thomas kept the floor running with the precision my father would have recognized. Priya kept the systems clean and current. The client relationships held because they had been built on years of reliable delivery, not on anyone's name in an ownership field. I made some changes in the first quarter after the ruling. Some were operational, updating governance documents, formalizing reporting structures, making clear who held authority over what. Some were personal. I had a small plate engraved and placed beside the door of the main conference room. It had my father's name and the years he had run the company, and below it in smaller letters the phrase he used most: "The work is what it says." I think about him every day, not with grief the way grief feels in the early weeks, sharp and exhausting, with something quieter, with the awareness that what he built is still standing and still being built, and that the person he trusted to carry it forward is exactly the person he always knew she was. I also think sometimes about what would have happened if I had panicked that Saturday morning at the dining room table, if I had cried or argued or made it loud, if I had let the shock of that folder drive me into a reaction instead of a response. I think about how differently it might have ended if I had moved too fast or spoken too loud or shown Margaret how much I was shaking inside. I did not shake on the outside. I made myself a cup of tea when I got home and I sat down and I thought about what my father would have told me. He would have told me to look at the facts clearly. He would have told me to be specific. He would have told me to find the right people and let them do their work. He would have told me that if something is true, the truth has a way of being documentable. He was right about that. There is a thing that happens when people use legal language or formal documents or authority positions to take something from you. They are counting on the shock of it. They are counting on the fact that the paperwork will feel overwhelming and official and final, and that you will not know where to pull the thread. Margaret had a folder. She had a document. She had a notary seal and an attorney's name and the word amendment and the word supersedes. She had watched me for 4 years and she believed she knew how I would respond. She did not know that I had spent 11 years learning to read a situation the way my father read a production report, not as a summary, as a story, and when I read that document I could already feel where the story did not hold. I'm not telling you this because I want you to think I handled it perfectly. I made mistakes in those 4 years. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I made allowances I should not have made. I told myself things were fine when something in me knew they were not. I was loyal to my father's peace at the cost of my own clarity, and that is not a pure virtue. That is a kind of avoidance dressed up as love. What I learned is that loyalty without discernment is not a gift to the people you love. It is a gap that the wrong people will fill. You can love someone completely and still be honest about what you are seeing. In fact, the deeper the love, the more important the honesty becomes. My father deserved my honesty years earlier. He might not have wanted to hear it, but he deserved it. I also learned something about documents, about signatures, about the things people put on paper and the things they assume you will never think to question. When something important is taken from you through paperwork, the answer is always more paperwork. More careful, more thorough, more precise. You do not fight a forged document with emotion. You fight it with documentation, expertise, process, and patience. That is not poetic, but it is true. And I learned this last thing, which is maybe the thing I hold most carefully now. The people who take from you are usually counting on the fact that you care more about peace than they do. They use your love and your loyalty and your desire to keep things quiet as the very tools they need to take from you. The moment you decide that peace is not worth more than truth, they lose the most important thing they were counting on. That moment, when it came, felt like setting something down that I had been carrying for a very long time. The company is doing well. We brought on 2 new engineering contracts in the quarter after the ruling. We promoted Thomas to Senior Operations Director, which should have happened 2 years earlier. We hired 3 people from the engineering school my father used to recruit from every spring because he believed in starting early with people who were still hungry to prove something. We updated the break room, which had needed updating since my father's time and which he had kept putting off because he felt guilty spending money on comfort when there were machines to maintain. I go to the office every morning. I eat lunch at the small table in the office that is now mine. I keep the chair across from me empty on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were our days. I do not always sit there and feel sad. Sometimes I sit there and feel exactly what I imagine he would have wanted me to feel, ready, clear, and certain about the work ahead. That is where the story ends and keeps going at the same time, because the company is not a conclusion. It is a continuing thing, and the person running it is continuing too. Ackles is not the woman who sat across from a folder on a dining room table and felt the floor shift. She is the woman who drove to her attorney's office that same afternoon, the woman who called the document examiner. The woman who showed up Monday morning as if nothing had changed because she knew that what had not yet changed still needed protecting. The woman who sat in that cardboard box moment and chose precision over panic. That choice is the whole story, really. Everything else is just what happened because she made it. Ackles did not win because she was lucky. She did not win because the system always works. She won because she stayed calm when they expected panic, stayed precise when they expected emotion, and stayed in that building when they expected her to walk out and not come back. And I want to ask you something before you go. Has someone in your life ever used paperwork, language, or authority to take something from you, something real or something emotional, and counted on the fact that you would not know how to fight back? Tell me in the comments, because the stories people leave down there remind me that Ackles is not the only one who has ever had to carry something like this. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to know what Ackles faces next, make sure you are not going to miss it.